The afternoon heat hung heavy over Maple Grove, Minnesota, creating a deceptive calm that blanketed the suburban neighborhood like a thick quilt. Sprinklers hissed across perfectly manicured lawns, sending arcs of water that caught the golden sunlight filtering through the maple trees that gave the community its name. Children's laughter echoed from backyards where families gathered for barbecues, and the rhythmic sound of a lawnmower hummed in the distance. Nothing in this picture-perfect American suburb suggested that within the next hour, an unexpected encounter would forever change the lives of several residents and one wounded soul who carried scars deeper than anyone could imagine. 2-year-old Emily Watson sat cross-legged on the checkered blanket her grandmother had spread across the front porch of the modest colonial house on Elm Street. Her chubby fingers worked methodically with wooden building blocks, constructing towers that she would gleefully knock down before starting again. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch, and a gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging from the eaves, creating a melodic backdrop to her innocent play. Margaret Thompson, whom Emily called Grandma Maggie, moved between the porch and the small flower garden that bordered the walkway, her weathered hands carefully tending to the petunias and marigolds that added splashes of color to the front of the house. At 73, Maggie had the energy of someone 20 years younger. Her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her favorite gardening apron tied securely around her waist. She hummed an old hymn as she worked, occasionally glancing over at Emily to ensure the toddler remained safely within the gated porch area. The afternoon routine was as predictable as clockwork. Emily's parents, both busy professionals, dropped her off each morning before heading to their respective offices in downtown Minneapolis. Maggie treasured these daily visits with her granddaughter, viewing them as the highlight of her retirement. The house, which had felt too quiet since her husband passed 5 years earlier, came alive with Emily's presence, filled with giggles, babbling, and the endless energy that only a 2-year-old could possess. As Emily stacked another block on her colorful tower, an unusual sound cut through the peaceful atmosphere of the neighborhood. It was a low, mournful whimper that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the white picket fence that enclosed Maggie's front yard. The sound was so unexpected and out of place in the cheerful suburban setting that it immediately captured Emily's attention. The little girl's hands froze mid-motion, a red wooden block suspended in the air as her bright blue eyes searched for the source of the strange noise. Her head tilted to one side, displaying the curious expression that never failed to amuse her grandmother. But this time, something in the child's demeanor was different. Instead of the fleeting attention span typical of toddlers, Emily seemed completely focused, as if the sound had awakened some primal instinct within her young heart. Slowly, Emily abandoned her blocks and crawled to the edge of the porch, her small hands gripping the wooden slats of the railing as she peered through them toward the street. What she saw made her gasp audibly, a sound that immediately caught Maggie's attention and caused the older woman to look up from her flowers with concern. Lying on the sidewalk directly across from their house was a large German shepherd, its powerful body trembling with obvious pain. The dog's thick coat, which should have been a rich combination of black and tan, appeared matted and unkempt. Even from a distance, it was clear that the animal was in distress. Its breathing was labored, and every few seconds, another pitiful whimper escaped its muzzle. Emily pressed her face against the porch railing, her young eyes meeting the dog's pain-filled gaze across the narrow street. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The whimpering stopped abruptly, and the German shepherd lifted its massive head slightly, as if sensing the child's presence. Their eyes locked in a silent communication that transcended species and age, creating an almost hypnotic connection that seemed to suspend time itself. The intensity of this wordless exchange was not lost on Maggie, who had been observing the scene with growing alarm. Her maternal instincts, honed by raising 3 children and now watching over her granddaughter, immediately kicked into high gear. The sight of a large, obviously distressed dog so close to Emily triggered every protective mechanism in her body. "Emily, sweetie, come away from there," Maggie called softly, not wanting to startle either the child or the animal with any sudden movements. She set down her gardening tools and began walking toward the porch, her movements deliberately calm, despite the anxiety building in her chest. But Emily seemed completely transfixed by the suffering animal. Her small body remained pressed against the railing, and she began making soft cooing sounds, the same gentle noises she made when trying to comfort her stuffed animals during bedtime. It was as if the 2-year-old understood that the dog needed comfort, even though she was far too young to comprehend the complexity of the situation. The German Shepherd, for its part, had not taken its eyes off the child. Despite its obvious pain, there was a calmness in its expression that seemed to mirror Emily's peaceful demeanor. The dog made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of the unpredictability that Maggie feared might come from a wounded animal. Instead, it simply watched the little girl with what could only be described as grateful recognition. As Maggie approached the porch, she could see more clearly the extent of the dog's condition. Its left front paw was held at an awkward angle, and there appeared to be something metallic glinting in the afternoon sun near the injured limb. The animal's ribs were visible through its matted coat, suggesting it had been without proper food for some time. Most heartbreaking of all were its eyes, which held a depth of sadness that spoke of suffering beyond just physical pain. "Emily, we need to go inside now," Maggie said more firmly, reaching the porch steps. She knew from experience with wounded animals on her late husband's farm that unpredictable behavior was always a possibility, regardless of how docile the creature appeared in the moment. The sound of Maggie's voice seemed to break the spell between child and dog. Emily turned to look at her grandmother, her little face scrunched up in the expression she wore when she was trying to process something beyond her understanding. She pointed toward the street and made more of her gentle cooing sounds, as if trying to explain to Maggie that the dog needed their help. It was then that the first sign of neighborhood awareness began to emerge. Mrs. Chen from the house next door stepped onto her front porch, a portable camera in her hand, as she had been documenting her prize-winning rose garden for a local gardening contest. The unusual sight of the large dog lying in the street immediately caught her attention, and she began recording, though more out of concern than any desire for social media content. From across the street, David Miller paused in his lawn mowing routine, the sudden quiet from his machine drawing attention to the scene. David was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who kept to himself, polite but distant, especially when it came to animals. Most residents assumed he simply wasn't interested in pets or the various strays that occasionally wandered through their streets. As more neighbors became aware of the situation, Emily remained fixated on the suffering dog, her young heart somehow understanding what the adults around her were only beginning to comprehend. The afternoon that had started with such peaceful predictability was about to transform into something none of them could have anticipated, setting in motion a chain of events that would reveal hidden depths in ordinary people and forge connections that would last far beyond this single moment of crisis. The gathering attention of the neighbors created a subtle shift in the atmosphere along Elm Street. What had begun as a quiet afternoon was gradually transforming into something more complex, as curious faces appeared at windows and several residents emerged from their homes to better understand the unusual situation unfolding before them. Sarah Chen adjusted the settings on her camera, her journalist instincts from her college days kicking in as she documented what appeared to be a stray dog in distress. As a freelance writer who often worked from home, she had become the unofficial neighborhood observer, always aware of the comings and goings of her fellow residents. The sight of the magnificent German Shepherd, clearly suffering and alone, stirred something protective within her that she hadn't expected. "Should we call animal control?" she called out to Maggie, her voice carrying easily across the short distance between their properties. The question hung in the air, practical yet somehow inadequate given the emotional weight of the moment. David Miller had shut off his lawnmower entirely now and stood at the edge of his driveway, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove. His usual reserved demeanor seemed more pronounced as he observed the scene, though there was something in his posture that suggested he was fighting some internal battle about whether to get involved. Meanwhile, Emily had managed to maneuver herself into a standing position while still gripping the porch railing, her determination to maintain visual contact with the dog becoming increasingly apparent. Every time Maggie tried to gently guide her away from the railing, the toddler would resist with the surprising strength that 2-year-olds could summon when they felt strongly about something. "Emily, honey, we need to let the grown-ups handle this," Maggie said softly, crouching down to the child's level. But even as she spoke the words, she found herself drawn to the dog's plight. There was something about the animal's dignified suffering that touched her heart in a way she hadn't expected. From down the street, Tom Bradley approached on his evening jog, his running shoes creating a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. Tom owned the local hardware store and was known throughout Maple Grove as someone who could fix almost anything. His practical nature and calm demeanor had made him a go-to person for neighborhood problems, though none had quite like this. "What's the situation here?" Tom asked as he slowed to a stop, his breathing only slightly elevated despite his run. His eyes immediately assessed the scene, taking in the injured dog, the concerned neighbors, and the small child who seemed remarkably focused on the animal. "Appears to be an injured German shepherd," Sarah replied, still recording intermittently. "Been lying there for about 10 minutes now. Poor thing looks like it's been through something terrible." Tom nodded thoughtfully, his experienced eye noting details that others might miss. "That's not just any injury," he observed, pointing toward the dog's front paw. "Looks like there might be something caught in there. Wire, maybe." As if responding to the increased human attention, the German shepherd attempted to shift position and a low whine escaped its throat. The sound was heartbreaking in its vulnerability, and it seemed to galvanize something within the small gathering of neighbors. It was David Miller who surprised everyone by taking the first step forward, despite his reputation for keeping to himself, especially when it came to animals. Something about the dog's suffering seemed to override his usual reluctance to get involved. He moved slowly and deliberately, his hands visible and non-threatening as he approached the curb. "Easy there, big guy," David spoke in a low, soothing voice that none of his neighbors had ever heard him use before. "Nobody's going to hurt you." But as David drew closer, the German shepherd's demeanor changed dramatically. The calm acceptance it had shown while watching Emily transformed into something much more defensive. The dog's ears flattened against its head, and a low growl rumbled from deep in its chest. It was clear that while the animal had found some comfort in the child's presence, it viewed approaching adults as potential threats. David stopped immediately, raising his hands slowly in a gesture of surrender. Okay, I get it. You've been hurt before by people, haven't you?" The exchange was observed with growing fascination by everyone present, but none more intently than Emily. The toddler had been following every movement, every sound, with the intense concentration that young children sometimes display when something captures their complete attention. And what happened next left all the adults speechless. Before anyone could react, Emily had somehow managed to unlatch the simple gate mechanism that secured the porch area. Her small fingers, driven by an instinct that defied her young age, worked the latch with surprising efficiency. The gate swung open with a soft creak, and the little girl stepped onto the front walkway. "Emily, no!" Maggie's voice carried a sharp edge of panic as she lunged forward, but Emily was already moving with the determined purpose that only toddlers possessed when they had set their minds on something. The child's short legs carried her across the small front yard and toward the street with a confidence that stunned everyone watching. There was no hesitation in her movements, no fear in her expression. She walked toward the injured German Shepherd as if she were simply approaching a favorite playground toy. "Somebody stop her," Sarah called out, her camera forgotten as maternal instincts took over, even though Emily wasn't her child. But something remarkable happened as Emily approached the dog. The low growling ceased immediately. The flattened ears relaxed, and the defensive posture melted away as if it had never existed. The German Shepherd watched the approaching toddler with what could only be described as recognition and relief. Tom, David, and even Maggie found themselves frozen in place, afraid that any sudden movement might disrupt whatever delicate communication was occurring between the child and the animal. Sarah continued to record, though her hands were trembling slightly as she witnessed something that seemed to defy conventional wisdom about children and strange animals. Emily reached the sidewalk and, without pause, lowered herself to sit cross-legged next to the German Shepherd's massive head. Her small hand reached out with the same gentle confidence she showed when petting the therapy dogs that occasionally visited her daycare center. The moment Emily's tiny fingers made contact with the dog's fur, something magical occurred. The pained whimpering that had been the soundtrack to the entire encounter simply stopped. The German Shepherd released what could only be described as a sigh of relief, a deeply human sound that seemed to come from the very depths of its soul. But it was what Emily did next that brought tears to several pairs of adult eyes. The little girl began to hum, the same soft melody that Maggie often sang to her during bedtime. As she hummed, her small hand continued its gentle stroking, and the German Shepherd gradually relaxed its head until it was resting partially in the child's lap. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," Tom whispered, his voice filled with wonder. It was then that the true extent of the dog's injury became visible. With the animal now calm and still, they could clearly see a piece of barbed wire embedded in its front paw. The metal twisted in such a way that any movement would cause additional pain. The wound appeared to be several days old, suggesting that the dog had been suffering for some time. David, emboldened by the peaceful scene before him, slowly approached again. This time, the German Shepherd showed no signs of aggression. Instead, it seemed to understand that help was finally at hand. "I'm going to get my first aid kit," David said quietly, not wanting to disturb the tranquil moment. "I think I can help with that wire." As David headed toward his house, more neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual gathering and the sight of little Emily sitting fearlessly beside the large injured dog. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the street. But the scene was illuminated by something brighter than sunlight, the pure, uncomplicated compassion of a child who saw suffering and responded with love rather than fear. Maggie approached slowly, her earlier panic replaced by amazement at her granddaughter's intuitive connection with the wounded animal. As she drew closer, she could see that both Emily and the German Shepherd seemed completely at peace, as if they had found in each other exactly what they needed in that moment. David Miller returned from his house carrying a well-stocked first aid kit that surprised everyone with its comprehensiveness. The plastic case looked professional, the kind typically found in medical facilities rather than suburban homes. As he knelt beside Emily and the German Shepherd, his hands moved with a practiced confidence that revealed skills none of his neighbors had suspected he possessed. "I used to be a veterinary technician," David explained quietly, noticing the curious glances from the growing crowd of onlookers. "Before I moved to Maple Grove, it's been a while, but some things you never forget." This revelation sent murmurs through the small gathering. David Miller, the reserved neighbor who had always seemed indifferent to the various pets in the neighborhood, had been hiding a background that made him perhaps the most qualified person present to help the injured animal. Emily remained perfectly still as David carefully examined the barbed wire embedded in the German Shepherd's paw. Her small hand continued its gentle stroking of the dog's head, and her soft humming provided a calming soundtrack to David's assessment of the injury. "This is going to need careful handling," David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. "The wire has worked its way pretty deep, and there's definitely infection setting in. But the good news is that if we can get it out cleanly, the paw should heal fine with proper care." Tom Bradley moved closer, offering his assistance. "What do you need me to do?" "I need someone to help stabilize him while I work on the wire," David replied, already laying out supplies from his kit with methodical precision. And we should probably have someone ready with a phone in case we need to call a veterinarian." Sarah Chen had been continuing to document the rescue efforts, but something she had captured earlier made her pause the recording and scroll back through the footage. Her eyebrows furrowed as she studied the small screen, zooming in on details that had caught her attention. "David, hold on a minute," Sarah called out, her voice carrying an urgency that made everyone look up. I think I might have something important here." She approached the group, holding her camera so others could see the display. "I was filming when the dog first tried to move, and I caught this." She played back a segment of video that showed the German Shepherd attempting to stand earlier before Emily had approached. In the background of the shot, barely visible but definitely there, was another figure. "See that?" Sarah pointed to a shadowy shape that appeared briefly at the edge of the frame. Someone was watching from behind that fence down the street, and when the dog saw whoever it was, he tried to move away, even though it clearly caused him pain. The group turned to look in the direction Sarah indicated, toward a house about 4 doors down that sat slightly apart from the others. The property was surrounded by a tall wooden fence, and unlike the well-maintained yards that characterized most of Maple Grove, this one had an overgrown, neglected appearance. "That's Frank Harrison's place," Tom said quietly, his expression growing serious. "He moved in about 6 months ago. Keeps to himself, but not in a good way, if you know what I mean." Maggie, who had been kneeling near Emily to stay close to her granddaughter, looked up with recognition in her eyes. "I've seen him around the neighborhood. There was something about him that always made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't put my finger on what." David paused in his preparation of the medical supplies, his attention now focused on the conversation around him. What kind of uncomfortable? Just the way he looked at people's pets. Maggie replied slowly, as if trying to articulate a feeling she had never fully examined before. "My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, has a little terrier, and whenever Frank would walk by while she was out with the dog, he would stare in a way that wasn't normal, like he was angry at the animal for existing." Sarah scrolled through more of her footage, looking for additional clues. "Wait, there's more," she said, her voice growing more excited. "Look at this segment from about 10 minutes before we all came outside." The new video clip showed the German Shepherd limping down the street, clearly in distress but moving with purpose. In the background, barely audible, voices could be heard coming from the direction of Frank Harrison's property. While the words weren't clear, the tone was unmistakably aggressive. "He's running away from something," Tom observed, watching the dog's behavior on the small screen. "Look at how he keeps looking back over his shoulder." Emily, who had been quietly watching the adults discuss the situation, suddenly pointed toward the Harrison house and made a sound that was distinctly different from her earlier gentle cooing. It was a sound of distress, as if the 2-year-old somehow understood that danger had come from that direction. The German Shepherd, still lying with his head in Emily's lap, also turned his attention toward the Harrison property. His ears flattened slightly, and a barely audible whine escaped his throat, confirming the adults' growing suspicions about where he had come from. "We need to get this wire out of his paw and figure out what to do next," David said, refocusing on the immediate medical needs. "But I think we're all starting to understand that this isn't just a case of a lost pet with an accidental injury." As David began the delicate process of removing the barbed wire, More neighbors continued to arrive. The Johnson family from 2 houses down appeared with their teenage daughter carrying a bowl of water and some old towels. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her small terrier on a leash, though she kept the dog at a distance out of respect for the German Shepherd's stress level. "I knew something wasn't right about that Harrison fellow," Mrs. Patterson said, in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. "My little biscuit gets nervous every time we walk past his house. Dogs can sense things about people that we can't." The German Shepherd remained remarkably still as David worked, though it was clear that Emily's presence was the primary factor in the animal's calm behavior. The child seemed to instinctively understand when the dog needed extra comfort, increasing the volume of her humming during the more difficult moments of the wire removal. "Almost got it," David murmured, his concentration intense as he carefully maneuvered the twisted metal. This wire was embedded deliberately, not accidentally. The way it's twisted, someone would have had to wrap it around his paw and pull it tight. The implication of David's words sent a chill through the gathered neighbors. This was not the result of an unfortunate encounter with a fence or construction debris. Someone had intentionally caused this animal to suffer. Sarah had continued documenting the rescue, but she was also making notes on her phone about the timeline of events and the various pieces of evidence they were uncovering. Her journalistic instincts were telling her that this story was bigger than just a neighborhood pet rescue. "There," David said with satisfaction as the last piece of barbed wire came free. The German Shepherd let out a long breath, and for the first time since the ordeal began, his tail gave a weak wag. Emily clapped her tiny hands together in delight, somehow understanding that her new friend was feeling better. But as David began cleaning and bandaging the wound, a new development caught everyone's attention. A figure had emerged from the Harrison house and was walking purposefully in their direction. Even from a distance, it was clear that Frank Harrison was not pleased with the gathering on his street. "Looks like we're about to get some answers," Tom said grimly, positioning himself slightly in front of the group in a protective stance. The peaceful rescue scene was about to take a dramatic turn, and everyone present could feel the tension building as Frank Harrison approached with obvious agitation. Emily, sensing the change in atmosphere, tightened her protective hold on her canine friend, as if preparing for a confrontation she couldn't fully understand, but somehow knew was coming. Frank Harrison's approach shattered the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over the rescue scene, like a rock thrown through a window. He was a man in his 40s, with the kind of build that suggested physical labor. Though his unkempt appearance and aggressive posture made him appear more intimidating than his actual size warranted, his heavy boots struck the pavement with deliberate force, each step announcing his displeasure with the situation unfolding in front of his neighbors. "Holmes, what the hell is going on here?" Frank's voice carried across the street with unmistakable hostility. His eyes swept over the gathered neighbors before settling on the German Shepherd, who had immediately tensed at the sound of the man's voice. "That's my dog, and I want everyone to step away from him right now." The peaceful scene that had developed around Emily and the injured animal suddenly became charged with tension. Several of the neighbors instinctively stepped closer together, while others looked uncertain about how to respond to Frank's aggressive demand. David Miller, who had just finished bandaging the dog's paw, slowly stood up while keeping his movements non-threatening. His years of experience with both animals and difficult pet owners had taught him the importance of remaining calm in volatile situations. "The dog was injured," David said evenly, his voice carrying none of the hostility that Frank had brought to the conversation. "We were just trying to help with a piece of barbed wire that was embedded in his paw." "I don't remember asking for your help," Frank shot back, his face reddening with anger. "Rex belongs to me, and what I do with my own property is none of your business." The casual way Frank referred to the German Shepherd as property sent murmurs of disapproval through the gathered neighbors. Emily, still sitting beside the dog she now knew was named Rex, looked up at the approaching man with the kind of innocent curiosity that 2-year-olds displayed when encountering something they didn't understand. But Rex's reaction to his supposed owner was anything but welcoming. The dog's ears flattened completely against his head, and his body began trembling again, though this time it appeared to be from fear rather than pain. A low whine escaped his throat, and he pressed closer to Emily as if seeking protection from the approaching threat. "That dog doesn't seem to recognize you as a loving owner," Sarah Chen observed, her camera still recording as she documented what was clearly becoming a confrontation. "In fact, he seems terrified of you." Frank's attention snapped to Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. "Turn that thing off right now, or you're going to have bigger problems than worrying about some stray mutt." "He's not a stray if he belongs to you," Tom Bradley pointed out, his hardware store owner's practical nature cutting through Frank's contradictory statements. "Indeed, and threatening your neighbors isn't going to make anyone more likely to cooperate with you." The tension in the group was becoming palpable. Some neighbors, particularly those with small children, began backing away from the confrontation, clearly uncomfortable with Frank's aggressive behavior. Others, however, seemed to be drawing strength from their numbers and their shared concern for the injured animal. Maggie Thompson found herself in an impossible position. Every instinct told her to grab Emily and retreat to the safety of their house, but her granddaughter seemed completely uninterested in moving away from Rex. The little girl had wrapped her arms around the German Shepherd's neck in a protective embrace that made it clear she had no intention of abandoning her new friend. "Emily, sweetie, come to Grandma," Maggie called softly, hoping to remove her granddaughter from what was clearly becoming a volatile situation. But Emily looked up at her grandmother and shook her head with the determined stubbornness that 2-year-olds could display when they felt strongly about something. More surprisingly, she then did something that left everyone speechless. The little girl struggled to her feet, her small body swaying slightly as she found her balance. Then, with a courage that defied her young age, Emily positioned herself directly between Rex and Frank Harrison. Her tiny arms spread wide in a gesture of protection, and she looked up at the much larger man with an expression of pure determination. "No," Emily said clearly, one of the few words in her limited vocabulary that she could articulate with complete clarity. "No hurt." The sight of a 2-year-old child standing as the only barrier between a large, frightened dog and an obviously aggressive man created a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Even Frank appeared momentarily taken aback by the unexpected intervention, but it was Rex's response that truly amazed everyone present. The German Shepherd, who had been cowering in fear just moments before, slowly rose to his feet despite his injured paw. Moving with careful deliberation, he positioned himself behind Emily, his large body serving as a protective shield for the small child who had chosen to defend him. When Rex lifted his head and released a deep, warning bark that echoed off the houses lining the street, Frank Harrison took an involuntary step backward. The sound was not the aggressive snarl of an attack dog, but rather the determined warning of an animal protecting something precious. "You see that?" Mrs. Patterson called out, her voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone who had witnessed something extraordinary. "That dog is protecting her just as much as she's protecting him. That's not the behavior of an animal that's been treated kindly by its supposed owner." Sarah, still recording, had captured the entire sequence of events. As she reviewed the footage on her camera's small screen, she made a discovery that changed everything. "Frank," she called out, her voice carrying a new edge of authority, "I've got you on camera from 3 days ago. Want to see what I recorded when you thought no one was watching?" Frank's face went pale, but his aggressive posture didn't waver. "I don't know what you think you saw, but you better be careful about making accusations you can't prove." Sarah turned her camera around so that others could see the screen. The footage showed a clear view of Frank's backyard, where a large German shepherd could be seen tied to a post with what appeared to be the same type of barbed wire that David had just removed from Rex's paw. In the video, Frank could be clearly seen approaching the dog with what looked like a stick or rod in his hand. "I was trying to document the noise complaints that several neighbors have made about your property," Sarah explained, her journalist instincts having led her to gather evidence before she even realized its importance. "But what I actually recorded was animal abuse." The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathered neighbors. Several people pulled out their phones, with some calling the police while others began their own documentation of the confrontation. Frank's demeanor shifted from aggressive to desperate as he realized the extent of evidence mounting against him. "That's private property, and you had no right to record on my land. That footage won't hold up anywhere." "Actually," Tom Bradley interjected, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who understood property law from his years as a business owner, "she was recording from a public street, which gives her every right to document what was visible from that vantage point." David Miller had been quietly checking Rex's other limbs during the confrontation, and his discoveries were disturbing. "This dog has multiple old injuries that are consistent with systematic abuse," he announced. "Healed fractures in his ribs, scarring on his back legs, and signs of chronic malnutrition. This isn't the result of accidental neglect." Emily, still standing protectively in front of Rex, had begun humming again, her soft melody serving as a counterpoint to the harsh voices of the adults around her. The German shepherd had lowered his head so that it rested gently on top of the little girl's head, creating an image of mutual protection that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Frank Harrison's face showed the first signs of genuine fear as he realized that his neighbors had moved beyond discussion and into action. But the arrival of law enforcement would bring its own complications, and the question of what would happen to Rex remained unanswered as the afternoon sun continued to sink lower in the sky over Maple Grove. The arrival of 2 Maple Grove police cruisers, their red and blue lights cutting through the growing dusk, marked a turning point that everyone present could feel in the air. Officer Rodriguez emerged from the first vehicle, her experienced eyes immediately taking in the unusual scene before her. A small child standing protectively beside a large German shepherd, a group of concerned neighbors, and one man whose aggressive posture suggested he was at the center of whatever conflict had prompted the emergency calls. Officer Martinez joined his partner, and together they approached the group with the careful attention to detail that came from years of responding to domestic disturbances. However, the presence of a 2-year-old in the middle of what was clearly a tense situation required a delicate approach. "I'm Officer Rodriguez," the lead officer announced, her voice carrying authority while remaining calm enough not to startle Emily or Rex. "We received multiple calls about a disturbance and possible animal cruelty. Can someone explain what's happening here?" Sarah Chen stepped forward, her camera still in hand and her journalist instincts helping her organize the information clearly. "Officer, we have video evidence of systematic animal abuse, and we believe this dog escaped from that man's property after being tortured." Frank Harrison immediately began protesting, his voice rising to a level that caused Rex to press closer to Emily. "These people are trespassing and making false accusations. That's my dog, and I want him returned to my property immediately." But Officer Rodriguez had already noticed several details that contradicted Frank's claims. Rex's obvious fear of his supposed owner, combined with Emily's protective stance and the fresh bandages on the dog's paw, painted a picture that was difficult to misinterpret. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back and lower your voice," Officer Rodriguez instructed Frank firmly. "There's a small child present, and your aggressive behavior is creating a dangerous situation." David Miller approached the officers with his veterinary credentials and the medical evidence he had documented. "Officers, I'm a former veterinary technician, and this animal shows clear signs of systematic abuse. The barbed wire injury was intentionally inflicted, and there are multiple healed fractures consistent with repeated trauma. Officer Martinez had been observing Emily and Rex during this exchange, and what he witnessed was remarkable. Despite the chaos around them, the little girl continued her soft humming while gently stroking the German Shepherd's head. Rex, for his part, remained calm and protective, his large body serving as a shield for the child while showing no signs of aggression toward the officers. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez addressed Maggie Thompson, "is this your granddaughter?" "Yes, officer. This is Emily, and I honestly don't know how to get her to move away from that dog. She's never shown this kind of attachment to an animal before, but something about this situation has brought out protective instincts in her that I didn't know existed." Sarah presented her video evidence to the officers, explaining how she had initially been documenting her garden, but had inadvertently captured Frank's abusive treatment of Rex over several days. The footage was damning, showing clear instances of intentional cruelty that went far beyond mere neglect. As Officer Martinez reviewed the video evidence on Sarah's camera, Officer Rodriguez ran Frank Harrison's information through their database. What she discovered added another layer of seriousness to the situation. "Mr. Harrison," Officer Rodriguez said, her tone becoming significantly more formal, "our records show that you have 2 prior arrests for animal cruelty in other jurisdictions, and there's currently an outstanding warrant for your arrest related to similar charges in Iowa." Frank's aggressive demeanor crumbled as he realized the extent of his legal troubles. The neighbors watched as the man who had been so threatening just minutes before began to understand that his pattern of behavior had finally caught up with him. "I want to call my lawyer," Frank said quietly, the fight going out of him as the reality of his situation set in. "You'll have that opportunity," Officer Martinez confirmed as he radioed for backup and animal control services. "But first, we need to secure this animal and ensure he receives proper medical attention." The mention of taking Rex away caused an immediate reaction from Emily. The 2-year-old, who had been relatively calm throughout the adult confrontations, suddenly began crying and tightened her grip around the German Shepherd's neck. Rex, sensing the child's distress, released a soft whine and nuzzled her gently with his large head. "It's okay, sweetie," Maggie said, kneeling beside her granddaughter. "The nice officers are going to make sure Rex is safe and gets the help he needs." But Emily's tears continued, and it became clear that the bond between the child and the dog had become so strong that separation was going to be traumatic for both of them. Tom Bradley stepped forward with a practical suggestion. "Officers, there's an excellent animal sanctuary about 20 minutes outside of town. Safe Haven Animal Rescue specializes in rehabilitating abused animals. They might be a better option than the county animal control facility." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a veterinarian who lived at the end of the street, had arrived during the police investigation after hearing about the situation from other neighbors. She examined Rex quickly and professionally, confirming David's assessment of the dog's injuries and overall condition. "This animal will need extensive rehabilitation," Dr. Walsh explained to the officers. "The physical injuries will heal, but the psychological trauma from systematic abuse requires specialized care. Safe Haven would indeed be the best option for his recovery." Officer Rodriguez nodded, appreciating the community input. "We'll coordinate with Safe Haven to transfer the animal, but I need to warn everyone that this will likely be a long process. Even if Mr. Harrison is arrested and charged, the legal proceedings could take months." The gathering neighbors had been listening to these discussions with growing concern, not just for Rex's welfare, but for Emily's emotional well-being. The little girl had stopped crying, but remained clinging to the German Shepherd, her small face showing a sadness that was heartbreaking to witness. Mrs. Patterson spoke up with the wisdom of someone who had raised children and grandchildren. And that little girl has formed a bond with this dog that goes beyond anything I've seen before. Separating them completely might cause lasting trauma for both of them. Sarah, still documenting the proceedings, had an idea. What if we organize regular visits? Safe Haven allows supervised visits for potential adopters. Maybe we could arrange for Emily to visit Rex during his rehabilitation. Dr. Walsh considered this suggestion carefully. Actually, that might be therapeutic for both of them. Animals recovering from abuse often respond well to consistent, gentle human contact. And Emily's presence clearly has a calming effect on Rex. As Frank Harrison was led away in handcuffs, his former neighbors watched with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. Justice was finally being served, but the more complex questions about Rex's future and Emily's emotional attachment remained to be resolved. The animal control officer, who arrived to transport Rex to Safe Haven, was experienced in handling traumatized animals, but even she was impressed by the unique relationship between the German Shepherd and the little girl. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted to the gathered adults. "Usually, abused dogs are either extremely aggressive or completely withdrawn, but this one seems to have found his emotional anchor in your granddaughter." As Rex was gently loaded into the specialized transport vehicle, Emily's tears began again. But this time, the adults around her were ready with reassurances and promises that this separation was temporary, not permanent. The evening sun had finally set over Maple Grove, bringing to a close a day that had changed everyone involved. But as the streetlights began to illuminate the neighborhood, it was clear that this was not an ending, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of both a rescued dog and the little girl who had saved him. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation on Elm Street, and the rhythm of life in Maple Grove had settled into a new pattern that revolved around regular updates about Rex's recovery and carefully planned visits to Safe Haven Animal Rescue. The sanctuary, nestled in the rolling hills outside of town, had become a second home for Emily and Maggie, who made the 20-minute drive every other day, with the dedication of family members visiting a beloved relative in the hospital. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the sanctuary's head veterinarian and Sarah's older sister, had taken a special interest in Rex's case from the moment he arrived. The German Shepherd's physical injuries were healing well under her expert care, but it was the psychological recovery that proved most fascinating to document. Rex had initially been withdrawn and fearful of all human contact, except for the sanctuary staff, refusing food and spending most of his time huddled in the corner of his recovery enclosure. That changed dramatically during Emily's first visit. Maggie still remembered the moment with crystal clarity. They had arrived at Safe Haven on a crisp Saturday morning, Emily practically bouncing with excitement in her car seat as they pulled into the gravel parking lot. The little girl had been asking about Rex constantly since their separation, and despite Maggie's concerns about whether the dog would remember her granddaughter, she had promised Emily they would see their four-legged friend again. Dr. Rebecca Chen had prepared them for the possibility that Rex might not show the same immediate connection in a new environment, especially given the trauma he had endured. But the moment Emily's small voice called out, "Rex!" from outside his enclosure, something magical happened. The German Shepherd, who had been lying listlessly on his bed, immediately lifted his head with an alertness that the sanctuary staff hadn't seen since his arrival. When he caught sight of Emily through the chain-link fencing, Rex struggled to his feet despite his still healing injuries and moved toward the gate with a purposefulness that brought tears to the adults' eyes. But it was what happened when the gate opened that convinced everyone present that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Rex, who had been fearful and defensive around all humans except his caretakers, immediately approached Emily with his tail wagging for the first time since his rescue. The little girl threw her arms around his neck, and both child and dog seemed to melt into an embrace that spoke of deep, mutual recognition and relief. "I've been working with traumatized animals for 15 years, Dr. Chen had told Maggie that day, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. It's as if they each hold a piece of the other's healing." The visits became a cornerstone of Rex's rehabilitation program. Emily's presence had a calming effect that allowed the veterinary staff to perform treatments and procedures that had previously required sedation. The German Shepherd would remain perfectly still during wound cleaning and physical therapy as long as Emily was nearby, humming her soft melodies and offering gentle encouragement in her limited vocabulary. But the impact of these visits extended far beyond Rex's recovery. Emily had begun showing remarkable development in her language skills, apparently motivated by her desire to communicate more effectively with her canine friend. She had learned new words like gentle, better, and home, which she used consistently during their visits to the sanctuary. The story of Emily and Rex had spread throughout Maple Grove and beyond, largely due to Sarah Chen's documentation of their journey. Her initial footage of the rescue had been picked up by local news stations, and the follow-up stories about their bond during Rex's recovery had touched hearts across the region. The sanctuary had received an unprecedented number of volunteer applications and donations, all inspired by the unlikely friendship between a 2-year-old girl and an abused German shepherd. David Miller had become one of the sanctuary's most dedicated volunteers, using his veterinary background to assist with animal care while finding a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since leaving his previous career. The quiet, reserved neighbor had blossomed into a community leader, organizing fundraising events and educational programs about animal welfare. "I spent years avoiding involvement because I thought it would be too painful to see animals suffer," David confided to Tom Bradley during one of their volunteer shifts. But watching Emily's fearless compassion made me realize that avoiding the problem doesn't make it go away. Sometimes you have to step forward into the discomfort to make a real difference." Tom had also found his role in the growing movement, using his hardware store as a collection point for pet supplies and sanctuary donations. The rescue had sparked something in the Maple Grove community that went far beyond concern for one dog. Regular meetings were being held to discuss establishing a permanent animal welfare program, and several residents had begun fostering animals from the sanctuary. Mrs. Patterson had surprised everyone by adopting a senior dog from Safe Haven, a gentle golden retriever named Charlie, who had been surrendered by owners who could no longer care for him. The sight of Mrs. Patterson walking both Biscuit and Charlie around the neighborhood had become a symbol of the community's transformation. But it was during Emily's 6th visit to the sanctuary that everyone realized how deeply the bond between girl and dog had grown. Rex had been cleared for outdoor activities as part of his rehabilitation, and Dr. Chen had suggested they take him to the sanctuary's large exercise yard for some supervised playtime. Emily had brought along her favorite stuffed animal, a small elephant named Peanut that rarely left her side at home. Without prompting from any adult, she offered the treasured toy to Rex, placing it gently beside him as he rested in the sunshine. The German Shepherd sniffed the elephant carefully before gently taking it in his mouth and lying down with it positioned protectively between his front paws. "She's sharing her comfort object with him," Maggie observed, her voice filled with wonder. "That's incredibly advanced emotional intelligence for a 2-year-old. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes in Rex's recovery file, and look at his response. He's not treating it as a toy to be played with or destroyed. He's protecting it the same way he protects her. They're creating a shared emotional language that transcends species." As Rex's physical recovery progressed, conversations about his permanent placement became more frequent and more complex. The German Shepherd was nearly ready for adoption, But the unique circumstances of his rescue and his extraordinary bond with Emily created complications that none of the standard procedures could address. Several families had expressed interest in adopting Rex, impressed by the media coverage of his story and drawn to the idea of providing a home for such a well-known survivor. But each potential adopter faced the same question. Would they be willing to maintain the relationship between Rex and Emily that had been so crucial to both their healing? During their most recent visit, Emily had done something that convinced everyone present that the question was no longer whether she and Rex should be separated, but rather how their connection could be preserved regardless of his final placement. As they prepared to leave the sanctuary, Emily had taken Rex's face gently in her small hands and spoken directly to him with startling clarity. "Rex, come home soon," she said, her words clear and purposeful. "Emily, wait." Rex had responded by placing his large paw on Emily's tiny hand, a gesture so human-like and intentional that it left no doubt about the depth of understanding between them. Dr. Chen pulled Maggie aside as they prepared to leave that day. "I need to be honest with you about something," she said, her professional demeanor softened by obvious emotion. "In all my years of animal rehabilitation, I've never seen a case where the separation of a rescued animal from their human bonding partner would be this potentially traumatic for both parties. We need to start having serious conversations about what Rex's permanent placement is going to look like." As they drove home through the familiar streets of Maple Grove, Emily fell asleep in her car seat, clutching a photo of Rex that Dr. Chen had given her. Maggie glanced at her sleeping granddaughter in the rearview mirror and realized that the decision about Rex's future was no longer just about finding him a good home. It had become about preserving a connection that had already transformed two lives and inspired an entire community to become better versions of themselves. The setting sun cast long shadows across Elm Street as they pulled into the driveway, marking the end of another day in what had become the most meaningful chapter of both their lives. The Maple Grove Community Center had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Nearly 50 residents packed into the main hall on a crisp October evening, 6 weeks after the dramatic rescue that had brought them all together. The autumn air carried the scent of falling leaves and the promise of change, which seemed fitting for a gathering that would determine the future of both a rescued German Shepherd and the little girl who had saved him. Dr. Rebecca Chen stood at the front of the room beside a large poster displaying Rex's recovery progress. The before and after photos told a powerful story of transformation, from the wounded, frightened animal who had arrived at safe haven to the healthy, confident dog who now greeted each day with cautious optimism. "Rex has made remarkable progress," Dr. Chen began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "His physical injuries have healed completely, and his psychological recovery has exceeded all our expectations. He's ready for permanent placement, but as you all know, this case presents unique circumstances that require careful consideration." Emily sat in the front row between her parents. Jennifer and Michael Watson, who had flown in from Minneapolis the moment they learned about their daughter's extraordinary bond with the rescued dog. They had initially been skeptical of the reports they received from Maggie about Emily's attachment to Rex, but a single visit to Safe Haven had convinced them that something truly special was happening. Maggie sat beside her son and daughter-in-law, her hand resting gently on Emily's shoulder as the little girl clutched the photograph of Rex that had become her constant companion. The 2-year-old seemed to understand the importance of the gathering. Sitting quietly, while the adults discussed her best friend's future, Sarah Chen raised her hand from the middle of the room. "Dr. Chen, can you explain to everyone what you meant when you told us that separating Emily and Rex could be traumatic for both of them?" Dr. Chen nodded, having anticipated this question. "In my professional opinion, Emily and Rex have formed what we call a therapeutic bond. Their connection has been essential to both their psychological well-being. Rex has learned to trust humans again through his relationship with Emily. while Emily has developed confidence, empathy, and communication skills that are remarkable for her age. Disrupting this bond could undo much of the progress both have made. David Miller stood up from his seat near the back. What are our options? Several families have expressed interest in adopting Rex, but how do we ensure that Emily maintains contact with him? Tom Bradley leaned forward in his chair. The real question is whether any of those families would be willing to commit to regular visits and ongoing contact. That's a big responsibility for adopters to take on. Mrs. Patterson raised her weathered hand. I've been thinking about this situation for weeks, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. That little girl didn't just save Rex's life. She became his family. How can we ask a family to adopt half of a bonded pair? The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Everyone present had witnessed the extraordinary connection between Emily and Rex, but hearing it described as a family bond gave new weight to the decision they were trying to make. It was then that Michael Watson stood up, his voice carrying the nervous tension of someone about to make a life-changing announcement. Jennifer and I have been discussing this situation extensively since we arrived in town. We came here expecting to find that our daughter had simply formed a temporary attachment to a therapy animal. What we found instead was something that has completely changed our perspective on what family means. Jennifer Watson joined her husband, her own voice trembling with emotion. We've watched Emily with Rex, and we've seen changes in our daughter that we never could have imagined. She's more confident, more caring, and more communicative than she's ever been. How could we consider breaking up a partnership that has been so beneficial for both of them? Emily seemed to sense that something important was happening. She stood up on her chair and looked around the room with the serious expression that had become familiar to all the neighbors who had watched her rescue Rex. "Rex, come home," she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Michael Watson knelt down beside his daughter's chair, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, sweetheart, Rex is coming home with us." The announcement sent a wave of emotion through the gathered crowd. Spontaneous applause broke out, mixed with tears of joy and relief from neighbors who had become invested in the outcome of this unusual adoption story. Dr. Chen wiped her own eyes before speaking again. "I have to say, this is the outcome I was hoping for but didn't dare suggest. Rex and Emily belong together, and the Watson family's decision to expand their household to include him is exactly what both of them need." Sarah Chen stood up, her camera ready to document this historic moment. "When do we get to see the official reunion?" "Actually," Dr. Chen smiled, "we thought this evening would be perfect for that. Rex is waiting in my van outside, and if everyone would like to witness his homecoming, we can make it happen right now." The community center emptied quickly as residents filed outside into the cool October air. Emily practically vibrated with excitement as she held her parents' hands, her eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of her beloved friend. When Dr. Chen opened the back of her van, Rex emerged with the dignity and confidence of an animal who knew he was finally going where he belonged. His coat gleamed with health, his injured paw showed no signs of lasting damage, and his eyes held the calm intelligence of a dog who had found his purpose. But it was when Rex saw Emily that the full magnitude of their bond became clear to everyone present. The German shepherd's entire demeanor transformed as he caught sight of the little girl. His tail began wagging with such enthusiasm that his entire back end swayed back and forth, and he released a series of soft whines that sounded remarkably like expressions of joy. Emily broke free from her parents' hands and ran toward Rex with the fearless confidence that had characterized their relationship from the very beginning. When she reached him, she threw her arms around his neck and pressed her face against his fur, both of them seeming to melt into an embrace that spoke of long separation finally ended. "Rex home," Emily declared, her voice muffled by Rex's thick coat. "Emily and Rex home." Rex responded by gently licking Emily's face and settling down beside her so that she could lean against his side. It was the same position they had assumed on that first day when a 2-year-old girl had chosen to comfort a suffering animal. But now it represented something entirely different, not just compassion, but family. The gathered neighbors watched in respectful silence as the Watson family officially welcomed their newest member. Michael and Jennifer knelt down beside Emily and Rex, their hands joining their daughters in gentle pets and scratches that the German Shepherd accepted with obvious pleasure. "You know," Tom Bradley said quietly to David Miller, "6 months ago, most of us barely knew each other's names. Now look at us. We're all family." David nodded, his own eyes moist as he watched the reunion. Emily taught us something important about what it means to see suffering and choose to act instead of looking away. This community will never be the same. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. That little girl showed us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to abandon someone who needs you. Rex needed her, but I think we all needed this reminder about what real compassion looks like. As the evening grew darker and the celebration moved toward its natural conclusion, families began to drift back to their homes along the familiar streets of Maple Grove. But the changes that had begun with a 2-year-old's act of courage would continue to ripple through the community for years to come. The Watson family's driveway became the unofficial gathering place for impromptu neighborhood meetings about animal welfare. David Miller's expertise led to the establishment of a permanent animal rescue volunteer program. Sarah Chen's documentation of Rex's recovery had inspired similar rescue efforts in surrounding communities, and Mrs. Patterson's late-in-life adoption of Charlie had sparked a movement to place senior animals with senior citizens. But perhaps the most profound change was in Emily herself. The little girl who had once been shy and reserved had become a confident, compassionate child whose first instinct was to help rather than to fear. Her bond with Rex continued to strengthen as they grew together, each learning from the other about loyalty, trust, and the kind of love that transforms lives. 6 months later, visitors to Elm Street would often see Emily and Rex playing in the front yard, their laughter and barking creating a soundtrack of joy that had replaced the silence that once characterized the neighborhood. Rex had become not just Emily's companion, but the community's symbol of second chances and the power of refusing to give up on those who need us most. The story of their rescue and reunion had spread far beyond Maple Grove, inspiring similar acts of courage and compassion in communities across the country. But for Emily and Rex, curled up together on the front porch where their journey began, the most important part of their story was simply this: they were home, they were together, and they were loved. Dear viewers, we hope that Emily and Rex's incredible journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has ours. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most profound acts of courage come from the purest hearts, and that love truly knows no boundaries. If this tale of compassion and community has moved you, we invite you to join our growing family of storytellers by subscribing to our channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Every day, we bring you stories that celebrate the extraordinary moments hidden within ordinary lives. Don't forget to like this video if Emily's fearless love and Rex's gentle spirit have inspired you to look for ways to make a difference in your own community. We can't wait to hear how their story has touched your life, and we'll see you in the comments section, where every voice adds to the beautiful tapestry of human connection that makes these stories so powerful.